Hey guys, most of us picture the medieval world as a place of stone castles, towering cathedrals, and armored knights riding off on grand quests. Yet the simple act of traveling from one village to the next was often far more miserable than any storybook ever admitted. What looked on the surface like ordinary dirt paths carried a deeper, quieter kind of hardship, one shaped by centuries of forgotten engineering, local neglect, and the raw realities of weather and politics. Today we're stepping into that world to see why medieval roads turned even the shortest journey into something exhausting, unpredictable, and sometimes outright punishing. Where are you watching from tonight, and what piece of history would you like to drift off to next? If this kind of calm, thoughtful look at the past helps you unwind, a quiet like on the video is always appreciated. And if you enjoy sinking into these long, layered stories, consider subscribing so more of them find their way to you. Let us begin, then, not with knights or kings, but with the ground beneath their feet. In the centuries we now call the Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th to the 15th, Europe's roads were not simply bad in the way we might casually imagine. They were the frayed remnants of something once magnificent, slowly unraveling under the weight of time, weather, and a fragmented political order that no longer had the will or the organization to keep them intact. To understand the misery they caused, we have to go back a little further than the medieval period itself, because the story really begins with the Romans. The Roman Empire had built a network of roads so advanced that parts of it still survive today. Straight, well-drained, paved with layered stone and gravel, marked with milestones, and wide enough for legions and supply wagons to move with remarkable efficiency. These were not luxuries. They were the arteries of an empire that needed to move troops, taxes, and trade across vast distances. When Rome withdrew from Britain, Gaul, and much of Western Europe in the 5th century, that infrastructure did not vanish overnight. It simply stopped being repaired. Local communities inherited stretches of these roads, but without imperial engineers, without centralized taxes earmarked for maintenance, and without the same urgent military necessity, the pavements began to crack, the drainage ditches filled with silt, and the once solid surfaces started to sink back into the earth. By the time we reached the High Middle Ages, say the 12th and 13th centuries, most ordinary roads had become something quite different. Wide, unpaved tracts of compacted earth that followed the easiest natural contours rather than the straight Roman lines. In dry weather they might be passable enough for a determined walker or a lightly loaded pack horse, but that was the exception. Rain, which fell frequently across much of northern and western Europe, turned these tracks into rivers of thick, clinging mud. Cart wheels sank axle-deep. Horses and oxen strained and slipped. Travelers on foot found themselves wading through knee-high sludge that sucked at their boots and soaked their clothing for hours on end. A journey of 10 miles that a Roman courier might have covered in a morning could now take the better part of a day, sometimes 2, depending on the season. What made this especially frustrating was how little could be done about it. In the feudal world that replaced Roman central authority, responsibility for road maintenance usually fell to the local lord whose land the road crossed. Yet lords had far more pressing concerns. Collecting rents, defending their holdings, hosting feasts, and fulfilling obligations to their own overlords. Repairing a muddy stretch of track that benefited merchants and peasants more than the castle itself rarely rose to the top of anyone's list. Some charters and manorial records do mention road work as a form of labor service owed by villagers, but this was usually limited to clearing the worst obstructions or filling the deepest ruts, never a systematic resurfacing. The result was a patchwork of half-hearted fixes that lasted only until the next heavy rain. Consider, for a moment, what this meant for ordinary people trying to go about their lives. A peasant farmer in rural England or France might need to take a cartload of grain to the nearest market town, perhaps 6 or 7 miles away. On a clear summer morning, the trip could feel manageable. But after even a moderate shower, the road became a quagmire. The wooden wheels of the cart, often rimmed with iron but still narrow, cut deep grooves that filled with water and stayed that way for weeks. The oxen or horses pulling it would tire quickly, their hooves caking with mud until they could barely lift their legs. The driver walked alongside, prodding the animals and trying to keep the load from tipping. By the time they reached the market, both man and beast were drenched, chilled, and exhausted, and the return journey, often carrying purchased goods or tools, promised to be no easier. Pilgrims faced the same roads, but with added layers of discomfort. A devout traveler heading to a shrine like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela might walk for weeks or months. The roads they followed were not paved pilgrim highways in the romantic sense. They were the same muddy tracks used by everyone else, shared with merchants, soldiers, and livestock. Wet feet led to blisters that turned septic. Mud soaked through leather shoes and woolen hose, never quite drying before the next day's march. Nights were spent in roadside inns or monasteries that were themselves often damp and overcrowded. The physical toll was constant, yet the spiritual promise kept them moving. The irony was not lost on medieval writers. The very roads that were supposed to lead the faithful closer to God were themselves a form of earthly penance. Even those who traveled with greater resources found the experience trying. A royal messenger carrying urgent letters from the king might ride a good horse and carry lighter loads. Yet he still had to contend with roads that could swallow a mount up to its belly in certain low-lying stretches. Nobles and their retinues moved more slowly, accompanied by wagons laden with tents, furniture, food, and servants. A great lord traveling between estates might require dozens of horses, carts, and attendants simply because the roads could not support faster or lighter movement. One 13th-century account describes a bishop's party taking 3 full days to cover 20 miles in winter because the carts kept getting stuck and had to be unloaded, dragged free, and reloaded again and again. The image of armored knights galloping freely across the countryside belongs more to tournament fields or carefully chosen battlegrounds than to the everyday reality of medieval travel. What compounded the misery was the near-total absence of reliable maps or waymarkers for ordinary travelers. Roman milestones had long since been toppled or quarried for building stone. In their place, travelers relied on local knowledge, church spires visible from a distance, or the direction of rivers. Getting lost on a poorly defined track could add hours or even days to a short journey. Bandits, too, knew the vulnerabilities of these routes. The same muddy isolation that slowed honest travelers also made ambush easier. A lone merchant with goods worth stealing was an obvious target, but even groups of pilgrims learned to travel in larger numbers for safety. And yet, despite all this, people kept moving. Trade continued. News spread. Armies marched. Life did not stop because the roads were difficult. It simply adapted to their limitations. That adaptation itself tells us something important about the medieval mindset. The discomfort was not seen as a failure of civilization in quite the same way we might view it today. Roads were part of the natural order of things, like the weather or the harvest. Improving them required money, labor, and cooperation across manors and lordships, resources that were usually directed toward more immediate concerns. Building stronger walls, enlarging churches, or stocking granaries against famine. The system, flawed as it was, had its own grim logic. Still, the practical consequences rippled outward. Markets were smaller and more local because moving goods any distance was expensive and uncertain. Prices fluctuated wildly with the season and the state of the roads. A bad winter could isolate entire villages for weeks, cutting them off from news, medicine, or emergency help. The slow pace of travel also shaped how power itself worked. Kings and great nobles spent months each year literally on the road, moving from estate to estate so that their households could live off the produce of each place in turn. What looks to us like restless royal wandering was often simple economic necessity. The roads simply would not allow large groups to stay in one place for very long without exhausting local supplies. As we sit here in our comfortable modern world, It is tempting to wonder how anyone endured such constant, grinding inconvenience. Yet for the men and women of the Middle Ages, this was simply how distance felt. A journey of 12 miles was not a casual errand. It was an undertaking that required planning, physical effort, and a certain stoic acceptance of delay and discomfort. The roads were not just inconvenient surfaces beneath their feet. They were a daily reminder of how fragmented and localized their world had become after the long shadow of Rome had faded. There is more to this story, of course, because the misery of medieval roads was never static. Different regions handled the problem in different ways, and over the centuries some modest improvements began to appear. But before we follow those developments, it is worth lingering a little longer on the lived experience itself, on the small, repeated frustrations that shaped the rhythm of medieval life far more than any grand battle or royal decree. Those small, repeated frustrations appeared in countless ways across the countryside, threading themselves into the ordinary decisions people made every season. Take, for instance, the weekly journey of a rural housewife in 13th-century Yorkshire or Normandy. She might rise before dawn to carry a basket of eggs or a small sack of cheese to the nearest market cross, a distance that on modern maps looks trivial, perhaps 4 miles along what the locals simply called the Old Way. In dry weather the path was a ribbon of beaten earth flanked by hedges or low stone walls, and she could manage the walk in an hour and a half. But after the autumn rains had settled in, the same route became a slick trench of ankle-deep mud mixed with animal dung and the debris of fallen leaves. Her wooden clogs, heavy with clinging soil, added pounds to every step. The basket grew heavier as her arms tired, and the hem of her woolen kirtle dragged through the worst patches, soaking up water that would not dry until long after she returned home. By the time she reached the market she was chilled to the bone. Her feet blistered where the wet leather had rubbed, and the eggs she hoped to sell might already be cracked from the jolting of the journey. The return trip, now carrying a small purchase of salt or a length of thread, felt even longer because the light was failing and the road seemed to have grown softer in the intervening hours. These were not dramatic hardships that chroniclers bothered to record in detail. They were the background noise of life, the kind of discomfort that shaped how far people were willing to go and what risks they accepted. A merchant moving a pack train of wool or wine faced the same ground but on a larger scale. His horses, shod with iron that wore down quickly on abrasive mud, required frequent pauses to rest and to scrape their hooves clean. If the track narrowed between 2 fields, the animals pressed close together, their loads brushing against wet branches and soaking the bales. One slip, one deep rut hidden beneath a deceptive layer of standing water, and a valuable horse could break a leg, turning a profitable trip into financial ruin. Medieval account books from monastic estates occasionally note the extra cost of road repairs for the pack animals. But the sums are always small and the work temporary, enough gravel thrown into the worst hole to get through one season, nothing more. Even the church, which in theory might have taken a broader view of infrastructure because pilgrims brought offerings to its shrines, rarely intervened on a grand scale. Some bishops did issue indulgences promising reduced time in purgatory to those who donated labor or money to mend a particular stretch of road leading to a cathedral, and a few surviving charters record villagers being excused from other services if they spent days hauling stones or digging drainage ditches. Yet these efforts remained local and episodic. A muddy lane repaired in May might be impassable again by November. The result was a landscape in which distance itself felt elastic. 10 miles on a good Roman remnant near an old imperial town might still feel manageable. The same distance across the clay-heavy soils of the Midlands or the waterlogged fens of East Anglia could stretch into an ordeal that required an overnight stop at a wayside alehouse whose own walls were often damp and whose straw pallets smelled of mildew. What made the experience particularly wearing was the sheer unpredictability. Weather in medieval Europe was not merely inconvenient. It was a dominant force that no one could reliably forecast beyond a day or two. A sudden summer thunderstorm could transform a firm track into a slippery slide within minutes, forcing travelers to seek shelter under trees or in the lee of a hedge while lightning flickered overhead. Winter brought its own distinctive miseries. Frozen ruts turned the road into a series of jagged ridges that jarred carts and bruised the feet of walkers. Thaws produced slush that penetrated every seam in clothing and left travelers soaked from the knees down. In the Low Countries and parts of northern Germany, where the ground stayed soft even in dry periods, some communities experimented with wooden causeways, long lines of split logs laid side by side and covered with gravel or brush. These corduroy roads, as later generations would call them, offered a brief improvement, but the logs rotted quickly in the damp climate, and maintaining them required constant labor that few villages could sustain year after year. Further south, in the sun-baked hills of central Italy or Provence, the story was subtly different yet still far from ideal. Here, stretches of genuine Roman paving sometimes survived beneath layers of dust and grass, offering firmer footing in dry months. Travelers might walk for miles on the original stones, their footsteps echoing faintly off the ancient surface. But even these remnants had their drawbacks. Over centuries, the paving slabs had shifted and cracked, creating treacherous gaps where an unwary foot or a cart could catch and twist. Flash floods in the narrow valleys scoured away the supporting gravel beds, leaving the stones loose and unstable. And when the rains did come in the Mediterranean winter, the same old roads could channel water like gutters, turning them into temporary streams that swept away smaller loads and forced everyone to detour across open fields. The contrast with the north was instructive. Where northern Europe struggled with mud, the south contended with erosion and heat that cracked both stone and resolve. Neither environment granted easy passage. These regional variations reveal something important about the medieval world that is easy to overlook today. The condition of the roads was never simply a matter of technological failure. It reflected the deeper political and economic fragmentation that followed the collapse of imperial authority. In areas where a strong central lord or a prosperous monastery held sway, a little more attention might be paid to the main routes that brought in rents and tithes. Elsewhere, where power was contested or resources stretched thin, the roads were left to fend for themselves. Legal codes sometimes tried to impose order. The English Assize of Arms in the 12th century, for example, reminded local officials that highways leading to market towns should be kept clear of brush so that travelers could see potential threats. But clearing brush did nothing to improve the surface itself. French royal ordinances under Philip Augustus spoke of the king's highway as a protected space. Yet enforcement depended on local bailiffs who had many other duties and limited funds. The law acknowledged the problem, but the ground itself remained stubbornly indifferent. One of the quieter ironies of this era is how people learned to live with limitations that we would find intolerable. Travelers developed small, practical adaptations that speak volumes about their resourcefulness. Some carried long staffs not just for support but to probe the depth of mud ahead and to lever a stuck cart free. Others wrapped their feet in extra layers of rags or used wooden pattens, overshoes with raised platforms, that kept the worst of the slime from their leather soles. Merchants traveling in groups sometimes sent a lightly loaded servant ahead on foot to test the route and return with word of the worst patches, allowing the main party to adjust its pace or even detour through a neighboring manor if permission could be negotiated. These were not grand solutions. They were the patient, daily negotiations with a landscape that refused to cooperate. And yet they worked after a fashion. Trade networks expanded slowly across the High Middle Ages. The great fairs of Champagne drew merchants from hundreds of miles away, their wagons creaking along the same imperfect roads that had carried generations before them. The system was inefficient, uncomfortable, and occasionally dangerous, but it was never entirely broken. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, signs of modest change began to appear in certain corners of Europe. Population growth and the slow revival of commerce placed new pressure on the old routes. Some towns, flush with wool or cloth money, started to fund small-scale paving projects in their immediate hinterlands, laying cobblestones or gravel beds along the final approaches to their gates. Monasteries, especially the Cistercians with their emphasis on practical labor, occasionally took on the repair of bridges and causeways as acts of charity and self-interest. A few visionary lords even experimented with levying small tolls, pontage or pavage, to pay for improvements, though these measures often met with resentment from those who had to pay them. These were incremental steps, easily reversed by war, famine, or a bad harvest. The Black Death, when it arrived in the mid-14th century, would disrupt labor supplies and shrink the very population that might have maintained the roads, but that catastrophe still lay just over the horizon. For now, in the decades before those upheavals, the roads continued to exact their quiet toll on everyone who used them. A knight riding to join his lord's retinue might complain in a letter about the state of his horse's legs after a week on the road. A nun traveling between convents might note in her account book the extra cost of hiring a guide because the usual path had become impassable. A merchant from Flanders, riding home from a fair in London, might describe how his goods arrived damp and mud-spattered, reducing their value in the eyes of buyers. None of these complaints changed the fundamental reality, but they remind us that the misery was not abstract. It was felt in sore muscles, ruined clothing, lost time, and frayed tempers. The story of medieval roads, then, is not one of dramatic collapse followed by sudden rebirth. It is a slower, more layered tale of inheritance, neglect, adaptation, and the gradual accumulation of small pressures that would eventually nudge certain regions toward improvement. We have lingered here on the everyday texture of that world because it is only by understanding the lived weight of those muddy tracks that we can appreciate why even the simplest journey carried a kind of unspoken burden. Yet the modest experiments we have just glimpsed, tolls, local paving, monastic repairs, hint that the long medieval afternoon was not entirely static. Different regions were already beginning to respond in their own ways, shaped by their soils, their rulers, and their particular mix of commerce and piety. And it is to those regional differences, and to the first tentative steps toward something resembling systematic maintenance, that the path now leads us next. Those regional differences revealed themselves most clearly when one looked beyond the general landscape of mud and neglect to the particular ways communities and rulers attempted to wrestle with the problem. In England, for instance, the concept of the King's Highway carried a certain legal weight that went back to Anglo-Saxon times and was reinforced under the Norman and Plantagenet kings. Royal justices on circuit sometimes inquired into the state of major routes during the Eyres, or traveling courts, asking local juries whether roads leading to market towns or ports had been properly cleared of undergrowth and whether bridges were sound. The famous Assize of Clarendon in 1166 and later statutes reminded sheriffs and lords that highways should remain open and passable, at least in theory. Yet enforcement was patchy. A lord who failed to maintain a stretch across his manor might be fined, but the fine was often small compared with the cost of proper repair, and the work itself still fell to the villagers who owed labor service. What emerged was a system of modest obligations rather than genuine engineering. A few days each year when tenants were expected to bring carts loaded with gravel or faggots of brush to fill ruts or reinforce verges. These efforts kept the worst disasters at bay, but they never transformed the roads into anything approaching the Roman standard. Across the Channel in France, the approach was similarly decentralized, though the growing power of the Capetian monarchy introduced new possibilities. Philip II Augustus, ruling at the turn of the 13th century, issued ordinances that spoke of protecting the public way, and his successors occasionally granted charters allowing towns to levy a small tax known as pavage specifically for paving the streets within their walls and the immediate approaches. Paris itself saw some of the earliest sustained efforts. By the late 12th century, certain main thoroughfares were being surfaced with cobblestones in the areas closest to the royal palace and the great markets. Yet once one left the immediate vicinity of the city, the old earth tracks resumed their familiar character. Local lords might repair a bridge if it served their own mills or hunting grounds, but the long rural stretches between towns remained the responsibility of whoever held the adjacent fields. Travelers crossing from Normandy into the Ile-de-France might notice a subtle improvement in the frequency of wayside crosses or small chapels that doubled as landmarks, but the surface underfoot told the same story of seasonal mud and slow progress. In the cities of northern Italy and the Low Countries, where commerce pulsed more vigorously, a different spirit took hold. The wealthy merchant republics and guilds of Florence, Genoa, or Bruges had both the money and the incentive to invest in their hinterland routes. Guild records from the 14th century sometimes mention contracts for laying gravel beds or repairing causeways that carried cloth or spices to the city gates. In Flanders, the famous drove roads, used by cattle drovers, were occasionally reinforced with wooden hurdles or layers of turf to prevent the animals from churning the surface into a swamp. These improvements were pragmatic and limited, paid for by tolls collected at town gates or by contributions from the very merchants who benefited, but they represented a small shift in attitude. Where trade flowed, the roads received a measure of care. Where it did not, the old neglect persisted. The contrast was sharp enough that a Venetian merchant writing home from Bruges in the 1320s could remark with mild surprise on how the final leagues into the city felt almost reliable compared with the mire he had endured for the previous week. Even these modest advances came with their own quiet complications. Tolls, however small, added friction to travel that many found irksome. A peasant bringing a few sacks of grain to market might grumble at the halfpenny demanded at a newly established toll booth, seeing it as yet another burden laid upon the poor by those who already enjoyed stone walls and dry floors. Some charters explicitly exempted locals from such charges on the main market road, but enforcement was uneven, and disputes over who counted as local could lead to arguments that delayed everyone. Moreover, the very act of repair sometimes made matters temporarily worse. When a stretch of track was dug up to lay fresh gravel or to deepen drainage ditches, travelers had to detour across neighboring fields, trampling crops and earning the resentment of farmers who saw their livelihood literally underfoot. A 14th-century English court roll records a complaint from villagers near Winchester who had been ordered to repair a section of the road to Southampton. The work took longer than expected, the detour ruined part of their spring sowing, and the finished surface lasted barely 2 winters before the rains returned it to its former state. These tentative steps toward systematic maintenance also reflected deeper changes in how medieval society thought about distance and obligation. The slow revival of long-distance trade after the year 1000 had created new classes of people whose livelihoods depended on reliable movement. Not only merchants but also the growing number of masons, carpenters, and itinerant craftsmen who followed contracts from one building site to another. Pilgrimage routes, too, exerted a gentle pressure. The great shrine at Canterbury in England or Compostela in Spain drew thousands each year, and while the church rarely funded roadworks directly, it did encourage almsgiving and labor donations that sometimes found their way into bridge repairs or the clearing of fords. A traveler who paused at a wayside hospital run by the Knights Hospitaller might find the adjacent lane in better condition than most, simply because the order understood that a passable approach encouraged offerings and maintained the reputation of the house. Yet for every small success there remained vast stretches where nothing had changed. In the forests and hills of central Germany or the remote marches of Scotland and Wales, roads were still little more than the trails worn by generations of feet, hooves, and cart wheels. Here, seasonal flooding could render a route unusable for weeks, and the nearest authority capable of ordering repairs might be days away. Armies on the march learned to send pioneers ahead to fell trees for corduroy sections or to build temporary bridges from whatever timber lay at hand. But these were emergency measures that vanished as soon as the soldiers passed. The ordinary traveler had no such resources and simply waited for the waters to subside or sought a longer, drier route that added miles to an already tiring journey. By the middle decades of the 14th century, these regional experiments were still fragile and localized, yet they hinted at a world that was slowly learning to expect a little more from its roads. The Black Death, sweeping across Europe from 1347 onward, would soon test that fragile progress in ways no one could have anticipated. The sudden loss of perhaps a third or more of the population meant fewer hands available for the annual labor services that kept ruts filled and ditches open. Manors stood half-empty, rents fell, and the urgent business of survival pushed road maintenance even further down the list of priorities. At the same time, the very shrinkage of the workforce drove up wages, making it more expensive for those lords or towns that still wished to invest in improvements. Some places responded by commuting labor service into cash payments that could be used to hire professional carters and laborers, a small but significant shift toward a more commercial approach to infrastructure. Others simply let the roads degrade further, accepting that journeys would take longer and that certain remote hamlets might remain cut off for much of the winter. The plague years also brought a subtler change in outlook. With fewer mouths to feed and more land lying fallow, some communities found themselves with surplus resources that could, in theory, be directed toward public works. A few monastic houses, spared the worst of the mortality or recovering quickly through new recruits, took the opportunity to enlarge their guest houses and improve the roads that led to them, hoping to attract the steady trickle of pilgrims that had become even more precious in uncertain times. Royal governments, eager to reassert authority after the demographic shock, issued fresh statutes reminding local officials of their duties toward the highways. In England, the Statute of Labourers in 1351 and subsequent laws tried to stabilize wages and compel work, including on public projects, though the results were mixed and often resented. What emerged from this period of upheaval was not a sudden golden age of smooth travel, but a patchwork of incremental adjustments that varied wildly from region to region. Some counties in southern England began to experiment with more permanent materials, larger stones for fords, occasional stretches of pitched cobbling paid for by local guilds. In the cities of the Hanseatic League along the Baltic, where trade in timber and furs moved by both sea and land, merchants pooled resources to maintain key overland links between ports. These efforts remained modest, easily overwhelmed by a single bad season, yet they represented a quiet acknowledgement that the old ways of simply enduring the mud were becoming less acceptable as commerce expanded and expectations slowly rose. The roads, in other words, continued to mirror the society that used them, fragmented, adaptive, shaped by local power and local need rather than any grand central plan. Travelers still planned their journeys with an eye to the weather and the calendar, still carried extra provisions against delay, still accepted that a trip of 20 miles might stretch into 3 days if the heavens opened. But beneath the surface of that familiar misery, small changes were accumulating. Tolls collected and spent, labor commuted into coin, bridges rebuilt with slightly better engineering. These were not revolutions. They were the first cautious steps along a very long path that would eventually lead toward the more organized road networks of later centuries. And it is precisely at this moment of cautious readjustment, as Europe emerged from the shadow of the Great Mortality and began to reassess what it could demand of its landscape, that new pressures and new possibilities began to appear on the horizon. Those new pressures and new possibilities took shape first in the quiet recovery that followed the Great Mortality, as surviving populations slowly rebuilt their fields, their markets, and their expectations of what a journey could reasonably demand. With fewer people working the land, wages for laborers rose sharply in many regions, and some lords found it more practical to pay cash for road work rather than rely on the old system of compulsory labor services that now yielded fewer hands. In parts of southern England, manorial accounts from the 1360s and 1370s begin to record modest sums spent on hiring professional carters to haul gravel from nearby pits and spread it along the worst stretches of the road to the nearest market town. These were not paved highways in any modern sense, but the addition of a firmer surface in key places reduced the frequency with which carts sank axle-deep after rain. A tenant farmer near Canterbury might still curse the mud on his boots, yet he could now complete the same 6-mile trip in half the time it had taken his grandfather, provided the weather held. The same economic shifts encouraged a subtle change in attitude among town authorities. In the wool trading centers of East Anglia and the West Country, guilds of merchants and clothiers began to petition for permission to levy small tolls on goods entering their gates, with the explicit promise that part of the money would be used to maintain the approaches. Surviving petitions from places like Norwich and Bristol described the old roads as greatly decayed and perilous, a phrase that carried both practical complaint and a note of civic pride. When grants were approved, the work was often carried out in stages, first clearing ditches to improve drainage, then laying a bed of broken stone or chalk, and finally topping it with a layer of rammed gravel that could withstand the passage of heavily loaded pack trains. These improvements were narrow and local, rarely extending more than a mile or two beyond the town walls, but they created oases of relative ease in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Travelers arriving at the edge of such a repaired stretch often remarked, in letters or account books, on the sudden firmness underfoot, a small luxury that made the remaining miles feel less punishing. Across the Channel, similar patterns emerged in the recovering French countryside, though the 100 Years' War complicated matters in ways that were both destructive and strangely constructive. Armies on the march required passable routes for their supply wagons and artillery trains, and so royal officials sometimes ordered emergency repairs or the construction of temporary causeways through marshy districts. These wartime efforts were crude and short-lived, yet they left behind a handful of better-drained sections that local communities later adopted for their own use. In the Loire Valley, for example, certain stretches of the old Roman road were cleared of encroaching brush and reinforced with fresh gravel during campaigns in the 1420s, allowing merchants to move wine casks northward with fewer delays. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The very conflict that tore the kingdom apart also forced a measure of practical attention to the arteries that kept trade and royal authority alive. Peace, when it came in fits and starts, allowed some of these ad hoc improvements to be maintained rather than abandoned. In the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire, the story took yet another turn, shaped by the autonomy of imperial cities and the growing influence of the Hanseatic League. Cities such as Lübeck, Hamburg, and Cologne, whose prosperity rested on both river and overland trade, invested more systematically in their hinterland routes. League records from the late 14th century describe contracts for the maintenance of Steinwege or stoneways, short paved sections linking city gates to the nearest river landing or forest edge. These were often funded by a combination of merchant contributions and tolls collected at city barriers, and they featured low stone curbs to keep carts on coarse and shallow drainage channels cut along the sides. A merchant traveling from Cologne to Frankfurt might still face long stretches of earth track, but the final approach to either city now offered firmer footing and fewer surprises. The contrast with more rural districts was stark. In the forested hills of Swabia or Bavaria, roads remained little more than widened tracks worn by centuries of use, where a sudden storm could still turn a day's journey into an exhausting ordeal of slipping hooves and waterlogged goods. These regional experiments, modest as they were, carried a deeper significance. They suggested that medieval society was beginning to treat roads not merely as inherited features of the landscape, but as something that could be actively shaped to serve economic and political ends. The slow rise of centralized royal power in England and France, combined with the commercial ambitions of Italian city-states and the Hanseatic ports, created pockets of investment that had been rare in earlier centuries. Yet the improvements remained fragile. A single bad harvest, a renewed outbreak of plague, or a local feud could halt work for years. Bridges built with fresh timber might be swept away in spring floods, and gravel surfaces could erode almost as quickly as they were laid if maintenance lapsed. Travelers continued to plan their routes with an eye to the calendar, avoiding the worst months of winter and the muddy weeks that followed the autumn rains. The lived reality for most people remained one of cautious calculation. How much extra time to allow, how many spare horses to bring, whether to risk a shortcut across open fields or stay on the known, if imperfect, track. One of the quieter contradictions of this period was the way in which better roads in certain places actually heightened awareness of how bad the others still were. A merchant who had enjoyed a smooth final approach into Bruges might grumble more loudly when he returned to the mire of the Flemish countryside beyond. A royal messenger riding the improved stretches near Paris would notice the contrast even more sharply once he left the royal domain and entered the lands of a lesser lord. These contrasts fed a growing sense, expressed in petitions and chronicles, that roads were a matter of public concern rather than purely local responsibility. In England, the first statutes explicitly devoted to highway maintenance began to appear in the 15th century, requiring parishes to appoint surveyors and to levy rates for repair. The language was still cautious and deferential to custom, but the principle was new. The road was no longer simply the concern of the manor it crossed, but a shared obligation of the community through which it ran. In the cities themselves, the changes were more visible and more immediately felt. Streets within the walls were increasingly paved with cobblestones or brick in the wealthier quarters, allowing residents to walk dry-shod even after heavy rain. Market squares that had once been churned into quagmires by the weekly press of carts and animals were now surfaced with more durable materials, reducing the stench and the slipping hazards that had once been accepted as inevitable. These urban improvements spilled outward along the main approach roads, creating a graduated experience of travel. The closer one drew to a prosperous town, the better the surface underfoot. For the ordinary traveler, this meant that the final stage of any journey often felt like a reward after days of discomfort, a small psychological lift that made the whole undertaking slightly more bearable. Yet even these advances came with their own subtle costs. The very act of paving or graveling a stretch of road required materials that had to be quarried, transported, and paid for, expenses that were ultimately passed on to those who used the route. Tolls, once rare and temporary, became more common and more resented. Farmers bringing produce to market complained that the improved roads benefited the wealthy merchant more than the smallholder who could scarcely afford the extra halfpenny. Some charters tried to balance these burdens by exempting local traffic or limiting tolls to certain seasons, but disputes were frequent and sometimes ended in court. The roads, in short, were beginning to reflect not only the practical needs of the age but also its growing social tensions. By the middle of the 15th century, these scattered improvements had created a landscape that was still overwhelmingly medieval in character yet contained the first faint outlines of something new. The old Roman remnants continued to crumble where they had not been repaired. The great rural tracts still turned to mud with the first heavy rain, and the majority of journeys remained slow, wet, and uncertain. But the accumulation of small changes, tolls collected and spent, labor commuted into cash, local statutes enacted, suggested that the long era of simple endurance was slowly giving way to one of deliberate, if limited, intervention. Kings and town councils alike were beginning to see roads as instruments of power and prosperity rather than mere facts of nature. The pressures that had built during the recovery from the Black Death were now combining with new commercial ambitions and stronger central governments to nudge the medieval world toward a different relationship with the ground beneath its feet. It is here, on the threshold of the late 15th century, that those new possibilities begin to take on clearer shape. The gradual revival of classical learning, the expansion of trade routes toward the Atlantic, and the first stirrings of what historians would later call the Renaissance all carried implications for travel that would only become fully apparent in the decades ahead. Yet the roads themselves, for the moment, remained stubbornly medieval, imperfect, demanding, and deeply woven into the daily texture of life. The story of their gradual transformation was far from over, and the next chapter would be written not only by kings and merchants but by the ordinary men and women whose feet and wheels continued to wear new paths across an ancient and still largely untamed landscape. Those ordinary men and women, whose feet and cart wheels had traced the same imperfect lines for generations, now found themselves moving through a landscape that was beginning to feel the first faint stirrings of deliberate change. In the closing decades of the 15th century, the gradual return of political stability in many parts of Europe, after the long wars that had drained both treasuries and populations, allowed local authorities to turn a more consistent eye toward the roads that sustained daily life. In England, the early Tudor monarchs, keen to restore order after the Wars of the Roses, issued proclamations that encouraged parishes to appoint surveyors of the highways, men drawn from the local gentry who were expected to organize labor and materials for the main routes. These surveyors worked within the ancient framework of manorial obligation, but the tone had shifted. Road work was no longer simply a seasonal chore to be endured. It was framed, at least in official language, as a duty to the common weal, a phrase that carried a quiet sense of shared benefit. A farmer near York might still spend 2 days each spring hauling stones to fill ruts along the Great North Road, yet he could now point to a royal statute that gave the task the weight of law rather than mere custom. The physical results of these efforts were modest but noticeable to anyone who traveled regularly. In the home counties surrounding London, certain stretches of the old pilgrim routes to Canterbury were given a more permanent surface of ram chalk and flint, creating a pale ribbon that stood out against the darker soil on either side. Travelers reported that their horses moved more surely here, and that carts no longer needed to be unloaded quite so often when the wheels sank. Yet the improvement was never uniform. Step a few miles beyond the jurisdiction of a diligent surveyor and the road reverted to the familiar mix of mud and potholes, as though the landscape itself refused to be tamed all at once. The same pattern repeated across the Low Countries, where the prosperous cities of the Burgundian inheritance continued to fund causeways across the polders, using bundles of brushwood and layers of clay to raise the track above the water table. A merchant carrying Flemish cloth toward Antwerp might enjoy several reliable leagues before the surface once again gave way to the soft, treacherous ground that had plagued his predecessors for centuries. What made these late medieval adjustments particularly interesting was the way they intersected with the daily realities of people who had never known anything else. A wool merchant from the Cotswolds, setting out for the great fair at Stourbridge, would now consult a hand-copied list of repaired sections provided by his guild, allowing him to plan overnight stops with slightly more confidence. The journey was still slow, still vulnerable to sudden rain that could soften even the newest gravel, but the margin of uncertainty had narrowed just enough to make long-distance trade feel marginally less like a gamble. Pilgrims heading to Walsingham or Compostela benefited in similar ways. The great trunk routes leading to ports or shrines saw more frequent bridge repairs and the occasional erection of stone markers that helped travelers gauge their progress without relying solely on church spires or local memory. Yet the discomfort remained woven into every mile. Wet boots still chafed, cart axles still cracked under strain, and the cost of hiring extra labor to free a bogged wagon could eat into the profit of an entire trip. The roads had not become easy. They had simply become a little less predictably cruel. Further south, in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon before their union under the Catholic monarchs, the vast plateaus and mountain passes presented their own distinctive challenges. Here the dry summer heat baked the earth tracks into hard ridges that jarred every bone, while winter rains carved deep gullies that could swallow a mule's leg in an instant. Royal charters from the 1480s began to speak of caminos reals, royal roads, and granted certain towns the right to collect tolls for their upkeep, particularly along routes used by the growing wool trade and the movement of troops against the last Moorish strongholds in Granada. These efforts produced short but vital sections of paved track through mountain defile, wide enough for 2 carts to pass and equipped with low stone walls to prevent falls. A traveler crossing the Sierra Morena might notice the difference immediately. the steady clop of hooves on firm stone replacing the familiar sucking sound of mud. The change was practical, born of military necessity and commercial ambition, yet it also carried a symbolic weight. The monarchs were visibly asserting control over the very ground that connected their expanding realm. In Italy, where the Renaissance courts and merchant republics competed for prestige as much as profit, the attention to roads took on a more self-conscious character. The Medici in Florence or the Sforza in Milan commissioned engineers to survey and improve key arteries, sometimes incorporating classical ideas drawn from newly studied Roman texts. A few surviving contracts described the laying of wider gravel beds or the construction of arched bridges that could withstand heavier loads. These projects were proudly recorded in civic chronicles, presented as evidence of enlightened rule and civic virtue. Yet even here the transformation was incomplete. The Grand Via Appia outside Rome remained a patchwork of ancient stone and medieval repairs, and the rural lanes that fed into the cities were still subject to the same seasonal whims as anywhere else in Europe. A scholar traveling from Padua to Bologna with a precious manuscript might enjoy the intellectual comforts of the Renaissance, but his physical journey would still be measured in sore muscles and the constant calculation of how much daylight remained before the next unavoidable stretch of mire. One of the subtler ironies of this period was how the very growth in travel and commerce that prompted these improvements also increased the pressure on the unrepaired sections. As populations slowly recovered from the demographic losses of the previous century, more people were on the move. Not only merchants and pilgrims, but also laborers seeking work, students heading to universities, and minor nobles attending royal courts. The result was a slow thickening of traffic that turned the worst ruts into deeper trenches and made the narrowest tracks feel more crowded and contentious. Disputes over right-of-way became common enough to appear in manorial court rolls, where villagers complained that passing droves of cattle had destroyed the verges they were legally bound to maintain. The roads, in other words, were beginning to reveal the limits of their medieval design. What had once sufficed for a sparser world now groaned under the weight of a society that was quietly outgrowing its inherited infrastructure. By the opening years of the 16th century, these accumulated pressures were starting to nudge authorities toward more ambitious thinking. In France, the Valois kings, consolidating power after the long English wars, began to experiment with centralized ordinances that required provinces to contribute to the upkeep of major arteries linking Paris to the frontiers. Similar moves appeared in the Habsburg lands, where the need to move troops and administrators across a vast and fragmented empire made reliable roads a matter of statecraft rather than local convenience. Printed itineraries and the first crude road maps, made possible by the spread of the printing press, began to circulate among educated travelers, offering written descriptions of the best routes and the condition of bridges and fords. These documents did not pave the ground, but they reduced the old fear of getting lost in unfamiliar country, allowing people to plan with a confidence their grandparents had never known. The lived experience of travel, however, remained rooted in the same earthy realities. A courier carrying dispatches from the court of Henry VIII might ride a well-bred horse along a recently surveyed stretch of the road to Dover, only to find the final approach to the port reduced to a quagmire by spring rains and the passage of too many wagons. A merchant from Augsburg, following one of the new printed guides through the Alpine passes, would still need to hire local guides to navigate the sections where snowmelt had washed away the previous year's repairs. The misery had not vanished. It had simply become more precisely documented and, in certain privileged corridors, slightly more manageable. Ordinary people continued to adapt as they always had, wrapping their feet against the wet, carrying staffs to test the depth ahead, accepting delay as part of the natural order. Yet they now did so against a backdrop of slow, uneven progress that hinted at larger changes yet to come. These early 16th century adjustments marked the point at which the medieval world of roads began to overlap with the expectations of a society on the cusp of the early modern age. The pressures of expanding trade, stronger central governments, and the slow spread of technical knowledge were converging in ways that would eventually reshape the landscape itself. Yet for the moment the transformation remained partial and local, a mosaic of improved stretches amid vast areas of familiar hardship. The ordinary traveler, whether peasant, pilgrim, or merchant, still measured distance not in miles on a map but in the feel of the ground beneath their feet and the hours lost to mud and miscalculation. And it is precisely here, as Europe stood on the threshold of new ambitions and new technologies, that the story of those roads and the people who walked them prepared to enter its next, more deliberate phase. That next, more deliberate phase unfolded gradually across the 16th century, as monarchs and civic leaders began to view the condition of the roads not merely as an inherited inconvenience but as something that could be shaped to serve the ambitions of stronger states and expanding economies. In England, the Statute of Highways passed in 1555 under Queen Mary formalized what had been piecemeal Tudor efforts, requiring every parish to appoint 2 surveyors of the highways each year and to organize 4 days of compulsory labor from local householders for repair work. The law was modest in its demands: no grand engineering projects, no central treasury pouring funds into distant provinces, but it marked a quiet shift in responsibility. Parishes were now expected to keep the main routes clear of obstructions, fill ruts, and maintain bridges, with fines for those who neglected their duty. A yeoman farmer in Kent might find himself summoned once or twice a year to bring his cart and team to the local stretch of the Dover Road, spreading gravel or trimming verges under the watchful eye of the surveyor. The work was still backbreaking and often rushed, yet the very existence of the statute suggested that travel was becoming a matter of public order rather than private endurance. The results varied sharply from one parish to the next. In wealthier districts near London or along the main routes to the ports, surveyors with energetic local gentry sometimes produced noticeably firmer surfaces, where wagons could roll with fewer stops and horses strained less against the mud. Travelers on the Great North Road might cover 15 miles in a day with relative ease if the previous season's repairs had held. Yet in remote upland parishes or in areas where the soil was heavy clay, the statute changed little. Labor was grudgingly given, materials were scarce, and a single wet winter could undo months of effort. Contemporary letters and household accounts still speak of journeys delayed by foul ways, of carts overturned in hidden potholes, and of merchants arriving at market with goods damaged by water that had seeped through poorly maintained drainage. The law had created a framework, but the ground itself remained stubbornly medieval in its habits. Across the Channel the pattern echoed with local variations. In France, where the Valois kings were consolidating authority after decades of religious and civil conflict, royal edicts under Henry IV in the early 17th century began to speak more forcefully of grands chemins that should serve the kingdom as a whole. Intendants were instructed to oversee repairs in the provinces, and some provinces experimented with corvée labor on a larger scale, drafting peasants for weeks at a time to work on routes linking Paris to the frontiers. These efforts produced short but impressive sections of causeway through marshy districts and occasional bridges rebuilt in stone rather than timber. A merchant traveling from Lyon to Paris might note with cautious approval how certain river crossings now felt more secure, yet the long stretches between towns still turned to rivers of mud after rain, and the additional traffic generated by growing royal administration only made the unrepaired sections feel more congested and contentious. In the Spanish territories and the Italian states the story was shaped by the demands of empire and the flow of American silver. The great roads leading from the ports of Seville and Cadiz saw increased attention because they carried not only domestic trade but the wealth that sustained Habsburg power. Local authorities widened certain tracks and reinforced fords to handle heavier mule trains laden with bullion or colonial goods. Yet even these vital arteries remained unpaved for most of their length. A courier riding dispatches from the New World might gallop the final leagues into Madrid on a surface that had been freshly graveled for the occasion, only to discover that the previous week's storm had already begun to reclaim it. The contrast between the image of imperial might and the daily reality of travel highlighted a deeper tension. The roads were being asked to support ambitions far larger than the medieval world had ever contemplated. Yet the techniques and resources available to maintain them had advanced only modestly. One of the quieter ironies of this transitional age was the way new forms of transport actually amplified the discomfort of the old roads. The introduction of sprung coaches in the later decades of the 16th century, first among the wealthy and then more widely among merchants and officials, promised greater comfort and speed. These vehicles, with their leather straps and rudimentary suspension, allowed passengers to ride inside rather than on horseback, protected from rain and mud to some degree. Yet on the same rutted tracks that had served packhorses and carts for centuries, the coaches bounced and jolted in ways that left travelers bruised and nauseated. A noble lady journeying from her country estate to court might arrive with her fine gown spattered and her body aching, complaining in letters that the new fashion of carriage had turned a tolerable ride into an ordeal. The very innovation that was meant to civilize travel exposed the inadequacies of the infrastructure beneath it, making the misery more noticeable precisely because expectations had begun to rise. By the early 17th century, these accumulating pressures were beginning to prompt more experimental responses in certain regions. In England, some parishes along major routes started to experiment with toll gates, collecting small fees from passing traffic to fund more consistent repairs rather than relying solely on compulsory labor. The idea was controversial. Many saw it as an unfair burden on the poor, but it allowed for the hiring of paid laborers who could work more efficiently than reluctant villagers. Similar toll systems appeared in parts of the Low Countries and along the Rhine, where commercial traffic was heavy enough to justify the investment. A traveler passing through such a gate might grumble at the halfpenny demanded, yet notice that the surface ahead felt firmer and the ditches better cleared than in neighboring districts. These were still local initiatives, easily reversed by war or economic downturn, but they hinted at a future in which roads might be maintained through something closer to a market mechanism than feudal obligation. The lived texture of travel continued to reflect this uneven progress. A student heading to one of the growing universities in Oxford or Leiden might plan his route with one of the new printed itineraries, calculating distances and overnight stops with greater precision than his medieval predecessors. Yet once on the road he would still contend with the same sucking mud, the same risk of ambush in wooded stretches, and the same need to pause frequently to rest his horse or free a stuck wheel. Pilgrimage, though diminished after the Reformation in Protestant lands, persisted in Catholic regions, and the routes to shrines like Loreto or Guadalupe saw modest improvements funded by pious donations. Even so, the physical toll remained constant. Wet clothing that never quite dried, feet that blistered inside leather boots, and a constant mental accounting of time lost to the landscape. As the 17th century gathered momentum, these scattered experiments began to coalesce into something that felt more purposeful. Absolutist governments, eager to project power and facilitate the movement of armies and administrators, issued fresh decrees urging greater attention to the highways. In France, the policies of Richelieu and later Colbert would build on earlier efforts, laying the groundwork for the famous royal roads of the 18th century. In the German principalities, princely courts sponsored surveys and small-scale paving projects to link their capitals more reliably with trade centers. The scientific revolution, with its emphasis on measurement and improvement, slowly began to influence how engineers thought about drainage and materials, though practical application remained limited. Printed guides and the first rough maps multiplied, giving travelers a shared sense of the network they moved through rather than relying solely on local knowledge. The ordinary men and women who walked or rode these roads still measured their days by the same earthy realities that had defined travel for centuries. The weight of mud on their boots, the creak of axles in deep ruts, the relief of reaching a stretch that had recently been repaired. Yet the threshold they had crossed was real. The medieval inheritance of neglect and local patchwork was now being challenged, however tentatively, by ideas of systematic maintenance, public responsibility, and economic utility. The story of the roads was entering a phase where ambition and practicality would increasingly collide, setting the stage for larger transformations in the decades ahead as Europe moved deeper into an age that would eventually demand more from its arteries than the medieval world had ever asked. As that collision intensified in the later 17th century, the ambitions of central governments met the stubborn practicality of local conditions in ways that produced both genuine progress and fresh layers of frustration for those who used the roads every day. In France, the policies pursued under Louis XIV and his minister Colbert brought a more coordinated effort to the network of grands chemins radiating from Paris. Royal intendants were given authority to enforce the corvée, drafting peasants from surrounding parishes for weeks at a time to clear ditches, spread gravel, and repair bridges along routes deemed vital for royal couriers, armies, and the flow of grain to the capital. Some stretches near major cities received a more durable surface of compacted stone and sand, wide enough for two carriages to pass without one sliding into the verge. A merchant traveling from Rouen to Paris in the 1680s might notice how the final 20 miles felt firmer under the wheels of his coach, allowing him to cover the distance in a single long day rather than two. Yet the improvement came at a cost that ordinary villagers felt keenly. Days lost from their own fields, tools borrowed without compensation, and a lingering resentment that the roads served the king's tax collectors and courtiers more than the local market cart. When heavy rains returned, as they always did, the new surfaces could crack and erode almost as quickly as the old ones, revealing that even royal ambition could not entirely override the soil and the weather. In England, the story took a distinctly commercial turn with the spread of turnpike trusts. The first Turnpike Act of 1663 authorized toll gates on the Great North Road between London and York, and over the following decades dozens more followed, each managed by local trustees who collected fees from travelers and used the money to hire professional laborers for repairs. This was no longer the medieval patchwork of manorial duty. It was a pragmatic bargain in which those who benefited most from better roads paid directly for them. A stagecoach operator running between London and Bath might now advertise a more reliable schedule, promising passengers that the worst ruts had been filled and the verges trimmed. On a dry summer morning, the journey could feel almost civilized, the coach swaying less violently and the horses maintaining a steadier pace. Yet the tolls themselves became a new source of irritation. Farmers driving livestock to market grumbled at the extra pennies demanded at each gate, while foot travelers sometimes slipped through hedgerows to avoid payment altogether, only to find themselves wading through the same neglected sidetracks that had existed for centuries. The system worked best where traffic was heavy enough to generate steady revenue. In quieter rural districts, the trusts were slower to form, leaving long stretches as muddy and unpredictable as they had been in the Middle Ages. These early turnpikes and royal roads carried a subtle irony that contemporaries only partly appreciated. The very improvements that made travel faster and more predictable also encouraged more people to take to the roads. Stagecoach services multiplied, private carriages became common among the gentry, and the volume of freight wagons increased as internal markets expanded. What had once been a quiet country lane could now see a steady procession of vehicles that ground the freshly laid gravel into dust in summer and churned it into deeper ruts when winter rains arrived. A traveler in the 1720s might cover 40 miles in a day on a well-maintained turnpike, a distance that would have seemed extraordinary a century earlier, yet he would still arrive at his destination with clothes dusted in grit or soaked through if the drainage failed. The discomfort had changed its character rather than disappeared. Less about being hopelessly bogged down for hours, more about the constant jarring of wheels on imperfect surfaces and the knowledge that every mile cost an additional toll. Across the German states and the Austrian Habsburg lands, similar experiments unfolded under the guidance of enlightened princes eager to strengthen their territories. In Prussia, Frederick William I and later Frederick the Great ordered surveys of military routes and directed provincial officials to organize labor for their upkeep, sometimes incorporating ideas drawn from French models. Sections of the road from Berlin to Potsdam were widened and given firmer foundations to support artillery trains, while merchants benefited from the same surfaces when moving goods between fairs. Yet the work remained seasonal and vulnerable. A thaw in early spring could still soften the best-laid gravel, forcing columns of soldiers or commercial caravans to detour across open fields and damage crops in the process. Travelers' diaries from the period often note these small but telling contrasts. A smooth league or two through a royal domain followed by miles of familiar mire once the boundary stone was passed. The patchwork nature of political authority in the Holy Roman Empire ensured that no single system could impose uniformity, so the experience of a journey depended heavily on whose territory one crossed at any given moment. By the middle decades of the 18th century, these developments had begun to intersect with the broader intellectual currents of the Enlightenment. Engineers and surveyors, influenced by new ideas about measurement and improvement, started to approach road building with greater precision. In France, the École de Ponts et Chaussées, founded in 1747, trained a corps of professional road builders who experimented with layered foundations and cambered surfaces designed to shed water more effectively. Some of their projects along the routes between Paris and the provincial capitals produced stretches that felt almost modern to those who remembered the old ways. A scholar or government official riding in a well-sprung carriage might cover the distance from the capital to Lyon in under a week, marveling at how the road seemed to anticipate the weather rather than surrender to it. Yet even these carefully engineered sections were the exception. Most of the kingdom's network remained under the older corvée system, and the burden fell disproportionately on the rural poor who could least afford the lost labor. The contrast between enlightened theory and everyday practice became a quiet undercurrent in contemporary writing, where reformers argued that better roads would stimulate commerce and bind the nation together, while peasants continued to measure their obligations in days stolen from the harvest. In Britain, the turnpike system reached its peak of expansion during these years, with over 1,000 separate acts of parliament by the 1770s creating a web of tolled roads that linked the major cities and industrial districts. The trustees, often local landowners and merchants, invested in techniques borrowed from the French school. Deeper drainage ditches, broken stone foundations, and occasional stretches of paving in the busiest sections. A commercial traveler moving between Manchester and Liverpool could now rely on a surface that remained passable even after moderate rain, allowing goods to reach market with fewer delays and less damage. The stagecoach network expanded dramatically, carrying passengers who paid premium fares for the relative comfort and speed. Yet the system was never without its contradictions. Toll gates became flashpoints for resentment. Riots occasionally broke out when rates were raised, or when locals felt excluded from roads they had once used freely. The very success of the turnpikes encouraged heavier traffic, which in turn required constant maintenance that strained the trust's finances. A farmer whose land lay beside a newly improved road might watch his hedges trampled and his ditches clogged by the increased flow of wagons, turning a supposed public benefit into a private nuisance. The lived reality for most ordinary people, therefore, remained a mixture of modest gains and enduring inconvenience. A village woman carrying eggs to the nearest market town might still choose the old footpath rather than pay the toll on the turnpike, accepting the longer, muddier route because every penny counted. A peddler with a pack on his back would tramp the verges where possible, avoiding the deeper ruts worn by carriage wheels. Even wealthy travelers in private coaches found that a sudden storm could still reduce their progress to a crawl, the wheels slipping in newly softened patches and the passengers jostled until their bones ached. The roads had become more reliable in the corridors that mattered most to commerce and government, yet they had not ceased to be shaped by the same fundamental forces of weather, soil, and human labor that had defined them for centuries. As the 18th century drew toward its close, these accumulated changes were creating the conditions for something larger still. The growth of manufacturing in Britain and the steady expansion of trade across the continent placed ever greater demands on the network. while new scientific understandings of materials and mechanics suggested fresh possibilities for construction. Engineers were beginning to experiment with different kinds of stone and binding agents, and the first hints of systematic surveying on a national scale were appearing in official reports. The collision between ambition and practicality had not resolved itself, but it had produced a landscape in which the medieval inheritance was now overlaid with layers of deliberate, if imperfect, intervention. Ordinary travelers continued to feel the ground beneath their feet in all its seasonal variability. Yet they moved through a world that was slowly learning to ask more of its roads and to invest more seriously in meeting those demands. And it is precisely at this threshold, as the pressures of an industrializing economy began to make themselves felt, that the next chapter in the long story of European roads started to take shape. As that threshold crossed into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the pressures of an industrializing economy began to reshape not only the volume of traffic but the very expectations people held for how a road should behave underfoot or beneath a wheel. In Britain, where the factory system and expanding coal and cotton trades generated unprecedented flows of raw materials and finished goods, the old turnpike system found itself stretched to its limits. Trustees along the busiest routes turned to new engineering ideas, most famously those of John Loudon McAdam, a Scottish surveyor who advocated building roads with layered broken stone that locked together under pressure, crowned slightly in the center to shed rainwater, and drained by carefully graded ditches. His methods, refined in the 1810s and 1820s, produced surfaces that felt dramatically firmer than the medieval mud tracks or even the earlier gravel patches. A stagecoach on the improved London to Birmingham Road could now maintain a steady 8 or 9 miles per hour on a dry day, covering distances that once required overnight halts in a single stretch of daylight. Merchants shipping cloth or machinery noticed fewer broken axles and less water damage to their bales, while passengers in the new mail coaches spoke with cautious optimism of arriving less bruised and more punctual. Yet even these carefully engineered macadam roads, as they came to be called, carried their own quiet contradictions. The very traffic they invited, hundreds of heavy wagons daily, ground the angular stones into a fine dust that rose in choking clouds during dry spells, coating travelers' clothes and irritating eyes and lungs. In wet weather, the dust turned back into a slippery paste that could still slow progress and cause horses to slip. A farmer driving his cart along a freshly macadamized stretch near Manchester might appreciate the absence of deep ruts, but he would still arrive at market with his boots caked and his load lightly powdered with grit. The tolls remained, and in some districts they rose to cover the higher cost of skilled labor and imported stone, sparking occasional protests from local carriers who felt the road had been improved for distant manufacturers rather than for their own modest needs. The lived experience of travel had become more predictable in the main corridors of commerce, yet it retained an undercurrent of physical discomfort that no amount of broken stone could entirely erase. On the continent, the pattern echoed with national variations shaped by politics and terrain. In post-revolutionary France, Napoleon's administration had already begun ambitious programs of road building to bind the empire together, constructing straight, tree-lined routes that prioritized military movement and administrative efficiency. Engineers trained in the École de Ponts et Chaussées applied layered foundations and cambered surfaces similar to macadams, though they often favored larger paving stones in the French style for the heaviest sections. After Waterloo, the restored monarchy and later the July monarchy continued the work, linking Paris more securely to the industrial north and the Mediterranean ports. A traveler crossing from Calais to the capital in the 1830s might remark on how the chaussées allowed a diligence coach to maintain a pace that felt almost effortless compared with the jolting journeys of his father's generation. Yet away from these trunk lines, the older parish and provincial roads remained much as they had been for centuries, subject to local neglect, seasonal flooding, and the slow accumulation of wear from peasant carts and livestock droves. The contrast between the grand imperial arteries and the muddy lanes that fed into them underscored how uneven the transformation still was. In the German states and the Austrian Empire, where political fragmentation persisted until mid-century, road improvements tended to cluster around the growing industrial centers and royal capitals. Prussian engineers experimented with macadam techniques along routes serving the coal fields of the Ruhr, while Habsburg administrators focused on passes through the Alps that carried trade toward the Adriatic. These projects brought modest gains in speed and reliability for merchants moving iron, textiles, or grain, but they also highlighted the limits of local resources. Stone had to be quarried and transported at considerable expense, and maintenance crews were often seasonal migrants whose work could wash away in a single mountain storm. A commercial agent journeying from Vienna to Prague might enjoy several well-maintained stretches funded by the state treasury, only to encounter long miles of unchanged earth track once he left the immediate vicinity of a major city or military depot. The discomfort was no longer the all-encompassing misery of the high Middle Ages, yet it remained woven into the fabric of daily movement, a reminder that even industrial ambition could not instantly remake an entire landscape. One of the subtler ironies of this transitional era was the way the very success of better roads helped to hasten their own partial obsolescence. As macadam surfaces and turnpikes reduced the time and risk of overland travel, they encouraged more people and goods to move, which in turn accelerated the development of competing technologies. The first passenger railways, beginning with the Liverpool and Manchester line in 1830, offered a smoother and faster alternative for long-distance journeys, drawing away much of the passenger and high-value freight traffic that had once sustained the turnpike trusts. Within a few decades, many trusts found their revenues declining even as maintenance costs remained high, leading some roads to fall back into disrepair or to be handed over to local authorities. A merchant who had once relied on the macadam road between London and Liverpool might now send his heavier goods by rail and use the old highway only for the final short leg to his warehouse, noticing how quickly the surface could degrade once the steady flow of stagecoaches diminished. The roads had improved enough to make railways thinkable, yet they had not evolved quickly enough to remain the undisputed masters of distance. Even so, ordinary people continued to rely on the road network for countless small journeys that railways could not serve. Village women walking to market, peddlers with packs on their backs, farmers moving livestock or hay. These travelers still measured their days by the feel of the ground beneath them. In rural districts far from the main trunk lines, the old earth tracks persisted, turning to mud after rain and dust in summer, requiring the same practical adaptations of staffs, pattens, and patient pacing that medieval forebears had known. A shepherd in the Yorkshire Dales or a vintner in the Loire Valley might travel the same lanes his ancestors had used, accepting the seasonal inconveniences because no rail line reached his remote corner and no turnpike trust found it profitable to intervene. The misery had become localized rather than universal, yet it endured in the places where economic pressure had not yet forced change. By the middle decades of the 19th century, these layered developments had created a European road system that was neither fully medieval nor fully modern. In the industrial heartlands of Britain, Belgium, and the Rhineland, macadam and early tarmac experiments produced corridors of relative ease that supported the rapid movement of goods and people essential to factory production. Elsewhere, the network remained a patchwork of improved arteries and stubborn local lanes, shaped by soil, weather, and the uneven reach of capital. Governments began to take a more direct interest, with national surveys and public works programs that treated roads as vital infrastructure rather than local responsibilities. Engineers debated the merits of different stone sizes, binding materials, and drainage designs, drawing on lessons learned from both success and failure. Travelers' accounts from the period reflect this mixed reality. Praise for the smooth stretches that allowed a day's journey to feel almost leisurely, tempered by frustration when a sudden detour or a neglected provincial road reminded them how much of the old world still lay beneath the wheels. The story of these roads, then, continued to unfold in the spaces between grand engineering and everyday use. As the century progressed, new materials and new forms of governance would press the transformation further, Yet the ground itself, its clay, its chalk, its mountain gravel, retained the power to slow, to soak, and to frustrate. Ordinary men and women still planned their movements with an eye to the season and the sky, still carried extra provisions against delay, and still accepted that even the best-laid road could not entirely free them from the ancient dialogue between human ambition and the stubborn texture of the earth. And it is here, amid the smoke of factories and the clatter of early locomotives, that fresh ideas about materials and maintenance began to emerge, pointing toward a future in which the road itself might finally be remade on a scale no medieval traveler could have imagined. Those fresh ideas about materials and maintenance began to coalesce in the closing decades of the 19th century, when engineers and local authorities started experimenting with binding agents that could lock the broken stone of macadam surfaces into something far more resilient. In Britain, the limitations of plain macadam had become painfully obvious as bicycle traffic surged in the 1880s and 1890s. Cyclists demanded surfaces free of the loose grit that could puncture tires or send riders skidding, while the growing number of heavy horse-drawn vans continued to grind the stone into dust. The solution arrived in 1902 when Edgar Purnell Hooley, a Nottinghamshire surveyor, patented a process of mixing tar with crushed stone and spreading it hot over a prepared foundation. The resulting tarmac, as it quickly came to be known, created a smooth, waterproof crust that resisted both summer dust and winter rain far better than anything that had come before. Along the main routes out of London or Birmingham, sections of tarmac began to appear, allowing cyclists to glide with unexpected ease and stagecoaches to maintain higher speeds without the constant rattle of loose stones. A middle-class tourist pedaling through the home counties in 1910 might describe the sensation as almost luxurious, the road seeming to cooperate rather than resist. Yet, the transformation was never uniform or instantaneous. Tarmac was expensive to produce and lay, so it appeared first on the busiest urban approaches and the most profitable turnpike remnants, leaving vast stretches of rural England, France, and Germany still reliant on the older macadam or even plain earth tracks. A farm laborer in rural Shropshire or the Pas-de-Calais might walk the same lanes his grandfather had known, his boots sinking into familiar mud after an autumn downpour, while only a few miles away the new black ribbon of tarmac carried motor buses and private cars at speeds that would have astonished a medieval pilgrim. The contrast created its own quiet irony. The very smoothness of the improved roads made the unrepaired ones feel more punishing by comparison, and ordinary villagers who could not afford bicycles or motor transport continued to experience the landscape much as their ancestors had, measuring distance in the weight of mud and the ache of tired legs. Across the Channel, the pace varied with national priorities. In France, the Third Republic expanded the network of routes nationales, applying tar-bound surfaces along the strategic arteries that linked Paris to the provinces and the growing industrial centers of the north. Engineers refined the camber and drainage techniques inherited from the Napoleonic era, producing stretches that could withstand the heavier loads of early motorized freight. A wine merchant traveling from Bordeaux to Paris in the years before the Great War might note with satisfaction how the final approaches to the capital now remained passable even in heavy rain, his wagon load arriving drier and less shaken than it would have a generation earlier. In the German Empire, similar efforts focused on the industrial Ruhr and the routes serving Berlin, where Prussian efficiency and private investment combined to lay tarmac and early concrete experiments along key corridors. Yet in the more remote Alpine valleys or the eastern marches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, roads often remained little changed, still vulnerable to spring thaws and summer thunderstorms that could isolate villages for days. The arrival of the automobile in the 1890s and its gradual spread after 1900 introduced an entirely new set of pressures and expectations. Early motor cars, fragile and underpowered, demanded surfaces smoother than anything the horse-drawn era had required. Their narrow tires cut into macadam and turned dust into a choking haze that coated windshields and lungs alike. Local authorities responded by accelerating the spread of tarmac and experimenting with concrete slabs in the most heavily trafficked sections. Yet the cost meant that many secondary roads stayed unpaved. A doctor making his rounds in a rural district of Yorkshire or Normandy might still find himself bogged down on a side lane after a night's rain, forced to walk for help while his motor car sat axle-deep in the same mud that had trapped carts centuries before. Wealthier motorists on the main highways, however, began to experience travel in ways that felt revolutionary. Windows up, dust minimized, distances collapsing from days into hours. The lived reality therefore split along lines of class and geography. The prosperous few celebrated the conquest of distance, while the majority who still walked, cycled, or drove horse-drawn vehicles encountered a patchwork world where modernity brushed against the stubborn persistence of the medieval inheritance. These early 20th century changes also carried deeper social echoes. The improved surfaces encouraged the first stirrings of mass motoring and tourism, prompting governments to think of roads as national assets rather than local conveniences. In Britain, the Road Board, established in 1909, began channeling petrol tax revenue into systematic improvements, while France and Germany invested in military roads that doubled as civilian arteries. Yet the work remained vulnerable to the same forces that had shaped travel for 1,000 years. A severe winter could crack even the best tarmac, and wartime demands during 1914 to 1918 diverted labor and materials, leaving many routes scarred by heavy military traffic. Post-war recovery saw renewed efforts, but the ordinary traveler, whether a factory worker cycling to his shift or a farmer taking produce to market, still navigated a landscape of uneven progress. The misery had become more selective, confined to the margins and the back roads. Yet it endured as a quiet reminder that the ground itself had not forgotten its old habits. By the 1920s and 1930s, the cumulative effect of these innovations was beginning to reshape the rhythm of everyday movement across much of Western Europe. Concrete and asphalt mixtures replaced tar in many places, offering greater durability under the growing weight of lorries and private cars. National highway programs took shape. Germany's Autobahn network, begun in the 1930s, represented the most ambitious attempt yet to create long-distance roads engineered specifically for high-speed motor traffic, with gentle curves, wide lanes, and surfaces designed to shed water and resist wear. In Britain and France, more modest trunk road schemes widened and resurfaced the old turnpike routes, bringing tarmac to corridors that had carried pilgrims and merchants since the Middle Ages. A family setting out on a Sunday drive in 1935 might cover 100 miles in comfort that would have seemed miraculous to their grandparents, the road now an ally rather than an adversary for much of the journey. Still, the network as a whole remained incomplete. Rural lanes, village streets, and the roads of poorer regions continued to demand the same patience and practical adaptations. Extra time allowed, spare tools carried, and acceptance of delay when the weather turned against them. The lived experience of those who depended on the roads every day therefore continued to blend old discomforts with new possibilities. A market gardener near Lyon or a delivery driver in the Midlands might appreciate the smooth final approach to town on a freshly asphalted stretch, yet the farm track leading from his fields would still turn treacherous after rain, forcing him to load his produce by lantern light and plan his departure with an eye to the sky. Cyclists and early motorists alike learned the limits of the new surfaces when they left the main highways. A puncture from a flint on an unrepaired verge or a sudden skid on loose gravel remained common enough to keep the sense of vulnerability alive. The roads had become more forgiving in the places that mattered most to industry and government, yet they had not entirely shed the character that had made medieval travel such a grinding affair. The dialogue between human ingenuity and the stubborn texture of the earth persisted, even as the scale of ambition grew larger than anything the Middle Ages could have envisioned. As Europe moved deeper into the 20th century, these developments pointed towards still more ambitious programs of road building and maintenance, driven by the rising tide of motor traffic and the demands of economic recovery after the Second World War. Governments began to speak of national highway systems that would connect every corner of the realm, experimenting with new concrete grades, reinforced surfaces, and planning techniques that treated roads as vital arteries of a modern state. Ordinary people, whether walking to the next village or driving to a distant city, found themselves moving through a landscape that was slowly but unmistakably being remade. The misery of the medieval road had not vanished entirely, but it had been pushed to the edges, waiting in the quieter lanes and the more remote districts where the old ground still held sway. And it is precisely in this moment of expanding ambition, as post-war planners and engineers prepared to lay down the first truly comprehensive motorways, that the story of Europe's roads prepared to enter its most transformative chapter. As post-war planners and engineers prepared to lay down the first truly comprehensive motorways, the story of Europe's roads entered a phase of reconstruction and ambition shaped by the urgent needs of economic recovery and the rising tide of private car ownership. In Britain, the first stretch of true motorway, the 8-mile Preston Bypass, opened in 1958, followed swiftly by the M1 in 1959, its wide, dual-carriageway design engineered for speeds that medieval travelers could scarcely have imagined. French autoroutes began to snake outward from Paris in the 1960s. Their smooth concrete surfaces and gentle curves, designed to carry the growing fleets of Citroëns and Renaults toward the Mediterranean or the industrial north. West Germany expanded its pre-war Autobahn network with fresh purpose, linking the industrial heartlands of the Ruhr to the ports and the eastern border, while Italy pushed its autostrade through the Apennines and along the Adriatic coast. These new roads represented a deliberate break with the patchwork inheritance of the past. No more reliance on parish labor or turnpike tolls, but state-funded arteries built with heavy machinery, reinforced concrete, and asphalt mixtures tested for durability under constant traffic. The lived experience of long-distance travel changed almost overnight for those who could afford a car. A family driving from Manchester to London in the early 1960s might cover the journey in a single comfortable day, the motorway's steady rhythm replacing the jolts and delays that had defined even the best macadam routes of the 1930s. A German salesman heading from Hamburg to Munich could maintain a steady pace without the old calculations of weather and surface quality that once governed every mile. Yet the transformation carried its own subtle ironies. The very speed and volume of traffic these motorways invited soon created new pressures. By the 1970s, congestion at peak hours turned the smooth ribbons into slow-moving rivers of metal, where drivers sat idling in exhaust fumes that no medieval mud had ever produced. Rural communities found themselves bypassed entirely, their old lanes falling into quiet disrepair as funds and attention flowed toward the high-speed corridors. A farmer in rural Normandy or the English Midlands might still navigate the same narrow, hedgerow tracks his ancestors had known, now potholed and overgrown because the main investment had shifted elsewhere. The misery of simple travel had not disappeared. It had been relocated to the places that modern planners considered secondary. These motorways also reflected deeper changes in how governments viewed infrastructure. Post-war welfare states and economic booms poured resources into roads as instruments of national unity and prosperity. In Britain, the 1960s and 1970s saw ambitious plans for a national network that would connect every major city, while France's Plan Routier and Germany's Bundesautobahn expansions aimed to knit together regions still recovering from wartime destruction. Engineers experimented with new materials, polymer-modified asphalt, grooved concrete for better grip in rain, electronic signage that could warn of hazards ahead, each innovation promising to tame the last remnants of unpredictability. A long-haul lorry driver crossing Belgium or the Netherlands in the 1980s might appreciate how the surfaces remained reliable even after heavy rain, the drainage systems carrying away water that once would have turned entire stretches into lakes. Yet the ordinary pedestrian or cyclist in a village just off the motorway still contended with verges softened by winter frosts and lanes narrowed by decades of neglect. The contrast between the high-speed world above and the slower, earthbound reality below highlighted a quiet divide. The roads had been remade for efficiency and speed, but not yet for every traveler who needed them. As the 20th century drew toward its close, these developments began to intersect with environmental awareness and the limits of endless expansion. Rising car ownership and freight traffic strained even the newest motorways, prompting planners to widen lanes, add electronic tolling, and experiment with smart roads that could adjust speed limits or divert traffic in real time. In the 1990s and early 2000s, countries like Spain and Portugal, catching up after decades of slower growth, built extensive networks of autopistas that opened up previously isolated regions, while the European Union coordinated cross-border projects to create seamless corridors from the Atlantic to the Baltic. A tourist driving from Barcelona to Paris along the improved routes might notice how borders had become almost invisible to the wheels, the road surface changing imperceptibly from one national standard to another. Still, the small journeys that formed the backbone of daily life, taking children to school, fetching groceries from the nearest town, or moving livestock between fields, often remained on the older, unmodernized lanes where mud and frost continued to exact their familiar toll. The story of these roads, even in the late 20th century, retained echoes of the medieval world that had first defined them. Engineers might design for speeds of 100 miles per hour, yet a sudden storm or a burst of heavy goods traffic could still expose weaknesses in drainage or foundation that would have been recognizable to a 13th century cart driver. Maintenance crews worked with machines their ancestors could not have dreamed of, yet the fundamental challenge remained the same: keeping the ground stable beneath the constant passage of wheels. Ordinary people adapted as they always had, checking weather forecasts before setting out, carrying emergency kits, accepting that a short trip on a back road might still take longer than expected. The discomfort had grown more selective, confined to the margins of the network rather than defining the entire experience, yet it persisted as a reminder that the landscape itself had not been entirely conquered. By the opening decades of the 21st century, these cumulative layers of improvement had produced a European road system that was, in its main arteries at least, more reliable and more extensive than anything the continent had known. High-speed toll roads, intelligent traffic management, and new surface technologies continued to push the boundaries of what a journey could demand of its users. Yet the quieter lanes and village tracks, those that had once been the only paths available, still carried the weight of centuries, their surfaces shaped by local soils and local budgets rather than grand national plans. The transformation had been profound, but it remained incomplete, leaving space for the next wave of ambition as populations grew, climates shifted, and the needs of an increasingly connected society placed fresh demands on the ground beneath our feet. And it is here, amid the hum of electric vehicles and the first experiments with autonomous road systems, that the long dialogue between human ingenuity and the stubborn realities of travel prepared to open yet another chapter. And it is here, amid the hum of electric vehicles and the first experiments with autonomous road systems, that the long dialogue between human ingenuity and the stubborn realities of travel prepared to open yet another chapter. In the early decades of the 21st century, governments across Europe began to integrate digital technology into the road network itself, embedding sensors beneath asphalt layers that could monitor surface wear, temperature fluctuations, and traffic density in real time. Smart motorways in Britain and the Netherlands adjusted speed limits automatically during heavy rain or congestion, while pilot projects in Germany and Scandinavia tested self-driving lorries guided by embedded magnets and cameras rather than human hands. An electric vehicle owner gliding along a French autoroute in the late 2010s might notice how the car itself seemed to anticipate the road ahead, its systems communicating silently with the infrastructure to smooth the journey in ways that no medieval cart driver could have conceived. The physical discomfort of travel had receded further still for those on the main arteries, replaced by a quiet efficiency that allowed drivers to focus on conversation or the passing landscape rather than the constant vigilance once required by potholes and mud. Yet even these advanced systems carried echoes of older limitations. The sensors and algorithms depended on stable foundations, and in regions with heavy clay soils or frequent freeze-thaw cycles, the underlying ground could still shift and crack the surface above, forcing maintenance crews to intervene with techniques that would have looked familiar to a 19th-century surveyor. A delivery driver in rural Wales or the Italian countryside might still rely on secondary roads untouched by smart technology. Where winter frost lifted the tarmac and spring rains pooled in the same low spots that had plagued travelers for centuries. The irony was gentle but persistent. The more sophisticated the main network became, the more noticeable the contrast with the quieter lanes that served everyday local needs. Cyclists commuting to work or parents driving children to school on those older routes continued to plan around weather forecasts and familiar ruts, accepting small delays as part of a rhythm that modern engineering had not yet fully rewritten. Climate change added a new layer of complexity to this ongoing conversation. Rising winter temperatures and more intense summer storms tested even the best-engineered surfaces, with heat buckling asphalt in southern Europe and prolonged flooding softening foundations in the north. Engineers responded by experimenting with permeable pavements that allowed water to drain through the road itself, or with recycled materials that could flex rather than crack under stress. In the Netherlands, where the battle against water had defined infrastructure for centuries, elevated sections and adaptive drainage systems were refined to protect both motorways and the ancient village tracks that lay nearby. A resident of a low-lying polder might watch as heavy lorries passed smoothly overhead on a raised autoroute while the lane leading to their own farm remained vulnerable to the same seasonal inundations that once slowed medieval pack trains. The discomfort had not vanished. It had simply been reframed as a shared challenge requiring constant adaptation rather than simple endurance. Across the continent, the early 2020s saw renewed investment in maintaining and expanding the network amid growing concerns about sustainability. Electric charging points multiplied along motorways, and some countries began piloting roads that could wirelessly charge vehicles as they drove, reducing the need for stops and further collapsing the time once lost to medieval mud or even 20th-century fuel breaks. Autonomous shuttles appeared in controlled environments such as airport links or business parks, offering passengers a glimpse of travel without a human driver at all. Yet the broader system still depended on the ordinary men and women who repaired potholes, cleared verges, and made daily decisions about which routes to take. A road maintenance worker in the Scottish Highlands or the hills of Provence might spend his days operating heavy machinery that laid fresh asphalt with laser-guided precision, only to return home along a narrow lane that required the same careful navigation his grandfather had practiced decades earlier. The dialogue between technology and the stubborn earth continued, quieter now but no less real. These developments also reshaped the social texture of travel in subtle ways. With fewer people needing to endure the physical hardships of poor surfaces on long journeys, the experience of distance itself grew more abstract for many. A student traveling by high-speed coach from Madrid to Barcelona could work or rest comfortably, the road beneath the wheels almost forgotten. Yet, in smaller communities, the old intimacy with the landscape persisted. Walkers and cyclists on local paths still felt every dip and rise, every patch of loose gravel or standing water, maintaining a direct, bodily connection to the ground that high-speed travelers had largely left behind. This divide created its own quiet reflection. The roads that once united people through shared discomfort now sometimes separated them by the very smoothness they provided to some and withheld from others. Local authorities, mindful of these gaps, began small-scale programs to resurface village lanes with modern but affordable materials, aiming to bring a measure of the comfort enjoyed on the motorways to the places where daily life actually unfolded. By the mid-2020s, the cumulative weight of these innovations had produced a road network that was more responsive and more integrated than at any point in its long history. Cross-border corridors hummed with electric and hybrid traffic guided by satellite and roadside sensors, while experimental sections in test beds across Europe explored surfaces that could repair minor cracks autonomously through embedded chemicals or heat-activated compounds. Planners spoke of resilient infrastructure capable of withstanding the uncertainties of a changing climate and an evolving economy. A freight operator moving goods from Rotterdam to Vienna could rely on real-time data to avoid delays, the journey unfolding with a predictability that stood in stark contrast to the seasonal uncertainties that once defined even the shortest medieval trip. Yet the ground itself, shaped by centuries of use and misuse, continued to remind engineers and travelers alike of its enduring character. In remote valleys or upland plateaus, where investment remained modest, the old earth tracks still turned soft after rain and demanded the same practical patience that had sustained generations before. The story of these roads, therefore, remains one of layered accumulation rather than complete replacement. Each new technology builds upon the foundations laid by earlier eras, Roman remnants still visible beneath some modern surfaces, medieval alignments still followed by certain motorways, 19th century drainage ditches incorporated into 21st century smart systems. Ordinary people continue to move through this palimpsest landscape, some gliding effortlessly along high-tech corridors, others navigating the slower, more intimate paths that link their daily routines. The misery that once made simple travel a grinding affair has been pushed to the margins, confined to the edges of the network or the edges of the calendar when weather intervenes. Yet the fundamental relationship between human ambition and the physical world persists, inviting constant negotiation and quiet ingenuity. And it is precisely in this moment of sophisticated adaptation, as new materials and new forms of mobility prepare to meet the challenges of the coming decades, that the long evolution of Europe's roads shows every sign of continuing its measured, uneven advance. That measured, uneven advance continues to unfold today, as engineers and policymakers grapple with the twin demands of sustainability and ever-increasing mobility in a world that feels both smaller and more fragile than ever before. Across Europe, pilot programs are quietly testing roads embedded with photovoltaic cells that generate electricity while vehicles pass overhead, turning the very surface that once swallowed travelers in mud into a subtle power source for nearby communities or charging stations. In parts of the Netherlands and southern France, these solar roadways have begun to appear on select stretches of secondary routes, where the gentle hum of traffic now contributes to the grid rather than merely consuming it. A local resident cycling home along such a section in the early evening might notice the faint warmth rising from the pavement on a sunny day, a small but tangible sign that the ancient dialogue between human movement and the ground beneath it has taken on an entirely new dimension. The discomfort of the medieval track has not been forgotten. It has been reframed as a challenge to be solved with materials that work in partnership with the sun and the rain rather than against them. These experiments sit alongside broader efforts to reduce the environmental footprint of the network itself. Recycled plastics and rubber from old tires are now routinely mixed into asphalt blends in Britain, Germany, and Italy, creating surfaces that are more flexible and longer-lasting while diverting waste from landfills. Maintenance crews in the Scottish borders or the Alpine foothills use drones and ground-penetrating radar to spot weaknesses before they become potholes, intervening with precision that would have astonished the parish surveyors of the 16th century. For the ordinary driver or cyclist, the result is a quieter kind of reliability. A commuter leaving a village outside Manchester or Lyon can set out with greater confidence that the lane will not suddenly betray them with a hidden rut or a stretch of standing water, though the deeper soils and older alignments still demand occasional caution when winter lingers or summer storms arrive without warning. The lived texture of travel has grown smoother in most places, yet it retains those small, intimate negotiations with the landscape that once defined every journey. What makes this contemporary chapter particularly layered is the way technology has begun to blur the line between the road and the vehicle. Connected cars now exchange data with roadside infrastructure, adjusting suspension or route in real time to avoid rough patches detected kilometers ahead. In test corridors across Scandinavia and the Low Countries, autonomous shuttles operate on dedicated lanes, carrying passengers who experience the journey as a calm, almost meditative glide rather than an active struggle against the elements. A traveler heading from a rural station to a nearby town in one of these vehicles might find themselves reading or simply watching the hedgerows pass, the road's imperfections largely invisible to the systems guiding the wheels. Yet, for those without access to such technology, the older patterns endure. Farmers, delivery cyclists, and walkers on unconnected lanes still feel the rise and fall of the ground in their bodies, still carry the small practical wisdom of checking the sky and the verges before setting out. The network has become a mosaic of speeds and experiences, where the high-tech corridors hum with efficiency, while the quieter paths preserve a more direct, bodily connection to the earth. Climate variability continues to test these advances in ways that echo older struggles. Prolonged droughts in Mediterranean regions can make asphalt brittle and prone to cracking, while intense rainfall events in northern Europe overwhelm even the best drainage systems, turning low-lying stretches into temporary lakes reminiscent of the medieval quagmires that once halted entire armies. Engineers respond with adaptive designs, permeable surfaces that absorb water like a sponge, or elevated sections that rise above flood levels, each innovation carrying its own cost and its own quiet trade-offs. A resident of a flood-prone valley in Belgium or eastern England might watch as heavy machinery reshapes the local road after a storm, the work efficient and precise, yet still requiring the same patient acceptance of delay that travelers knew centuries ago. The misery has become less frequent and less universal, but it has not disappeared. It has simply learned to appear in new guises, reminding us that the ground retains its power to surprise and to slow even the most sophisticated plans. At the same time, social and economic shifts are reshaping who uses these roads and why. Remote work and online commerce have reduced some daily commuting on the main arteries, allowing maintenance budgets to focus more sharply on the neglected rural lanes that serve smaller communities. Village councils in parts of Wales, Provence, and Bavaria have begun modest resurfacing projects using locally sourced stone and modern binders, aiming to bring a measure of modern comfort to paths that once carried pack horses and pilgrims. A young parent pushing a pram along such a renewed track might notice how the surface now resists the worst of the winter mud, making the short walk to the school gate feel less like an ordeal and more like an ordinary part of the day. These small-scale improvements carry a gentle resonance. They suggest that the long story of Europe's roads is not only about grand motorways and smart systems, but also about returning attention to the quiet places where daily life still unfolds at a slower pace. The quiet accumulation of these changes points toward a future in which the road network might become more responsive, more sustainable, and more attuned to the varied needs of those who travel upon it. Researchers are exploring self-healing asphalt that can mend its own cracks through embedded bacteria or microcapsules, while urban planners experiment with shared spaces that blend roads, paths, and green corridors into a single, multifunctional landscape. In the coming years, these ideas will likely spread from test sites into everyday use, reshaping not only how we move but how we think about the ground that carries us. A long-haul driver on an upgraded corridor or a walker on a village lane will both encounter a system that feels less like a battle against nature and more like a careful negotiation with it. Yet the fundamental relationship remains the same: human ambition meeting the stubborn, changeable realities of soil, weather, and time. And it is in this ongoing negotiation, as new materials and new ways of traveling continue to emerge, that the evolution of Europe's roads shows every sign of pressing forward into still uncharted territory. And it is in this ongoing negotiation, as new materials and new ways of traveling continue to emerge, that the evolution of Europe's roads shows every sign of pressing forward into still uncharted territory. Laboratories scattered from Helsinki to Lisbon are now prototyping surfaces that respond almost like living tissue, incorporating phase-change materials that absorb heat during the day and release it at night to prevent ice formation, or graphene-infused asphalt that conducts electricity while remaining flexible enough to withstand the constant flex of heavy traffic. A test section outside Munich might appear unremarkable to the passing motorist, Yet its embedded network of tiny sensors and responsive compounds quietly adjusts to temperature swings and load stress in real time, repairing microfractures before they widen into the kind of ruts that once swallowed cartwheels for days on end. The medieval traveler who paused to lever a bogged wagon free with a long staff would scarcely recognize the quiet intelligence now woven into the ground itself. Yet the underlying challenge remains the same: coaxing the earth to support human movement without exacting too high a price in time, effort, or discomfort. These innovations arrive at a moment when daily travel patterns are themselves shifting in subtle but profound ways. Remote work and flexible schedules have eased some of the relentless pressure on the busiest motorways, allowing maintenance teams to focus more attention on the secondary and rural networks that serve smaller communities. In parts of rural Wales, the Dordogne, and the Bavarian countryside, modest resurfacing projects using permeable, low-impact materials have begun to bring a gentle measure of modern reliability to lanes that still follow medieval alignments worn by centuries of feet and hooves. A village schoolteacher walking her children along such a renewed path on a damp autumn morning might notice how the surface drains more effectively than it did a decade ago, reducing the familiar squelch of mud that once soaked through leather boots and woolen hose. The misery has not been eradicated, but it has been tamed in these quieter corners, where the scale of improvement matches the scale of everyday life rather than the grand ambitions of national corridors. At the same time, the growing emphasis on active travel, cycling, walking, and e-scooters has prompted planners to rethink the edges of the road network. Dedicated greenways and shared-use paths are being woven alongside or between the older routes, often following the very tracks that once carried pilgrims and merchants through forests and fields. In the Netherlands and Denmark, these paths feature smooth, vibration-dampening surfaces designed specifically for human-powered movement, complete with subtle lighting and weather monitoring apps that help users avoid the worst of the rain. A commuter cycling from a suburban home to a city office in Copenhagen might experience the journey as a calm, almost meditative interlude, the road surface cooperating so fully that the physical effort feels rewarding rather than punishing. Yet even here, the older truth lingers. A sudden storm or an unrepaired section of verge can still introduce the small, familiar inconveniences that remind us how closely our modern comfort remains tethered to the same soil and sky that shaped the Middle Ages. The broader European context adds another layer to this story. Cross-border initiatives under the European Green Deal are encouraging the harmonization of standards for everything from drainage design to noise reduction, so that a driver crossing from France into Spain or from Germany into Poland notices fewer abrupt changes in surface quality or signage. High-speed freight corridors linking the ports of Rotterdam and Hamburg to the manufacturing centers of Central Europe now incorporate noise-absorbing barriers and wildlife underpasses that reflect a more thoughtful relationship between infrastructure and the living landscape. A long-distance lorry driver making the run from the North Sea to the Alps might appreciate how the journey unfolds with fewer surprises, the road ahead mapped and monitored in ways that medieval messengers could only dream of when they relied on church spires and local memory to find their way. Still, the human scale persists in the small decisions made every day, choosing a route that avoids known flood-prone dips, carrying an extra layer against unexpected chill, or simply accepting that even the smartest system cannot eliminate every delay when nature intervenes. These contemporary developments also invite a quieter reflection on the long arc we have followed. The same ground that once turned to sucking mire beneath the feet of peasants and pilgrims now carries electric vehicles guided by satellites and algorithms. Yet in remote districts or after extreme weather, the old vulnerabilities can reappear with surprising suddenness. Engineers speak of resilience and adaptability, terms that would have felt foreign to a 13th-century lord ordering his tenants to clear a ditch, yet the underlying task is recognizably the same: keeping the path open so that people and goods can move with a measure of confidence. A farmer in the Polish countryside or a delivery rider in the hills above Nice might still factor the season and the forecast into every short trip, their practical wisdom a direct inheritance from generations who learned to read the landscape the hard way. The discomfort has become rarer and more localized, but its occasional return serves as a gentle reminder that no amount of technology fully severs the bond between traveler and terrain. As these layers of innovation continue to build upon one another, the road network is gradually becoming something more integrated and more responsive than at any previous point in its history. International research consortia are exploring concepts such as dynamic lane allocation that can reshape the carriageway itself during peak hours, or surfaces that harvest kinetic energy from passing traffic to power nearby communities. Pilot zones in Italy and Sweden are already testing stretches where the road can communicate directly with connected vehicles to warn of black ice or debris before the driver's eyes have even registered the hazard. The pace of change feels measured rather than revolutionary, unfolding in careful trials and incremental upgrades that respect both the massive investment already embedded in the existing system and the practical needs of the millions who use it every day. A family driving through the French countryside on a summer evening might notice how the road seems to anticipate their comfort, adjusting lighting or signage with unobtrusive intelligence, while still allowing them to feel the gentle rhythm of the landscape rolling past. The story of these roads, even now, continues to be written in the small, repeated negotiations between people and the ground they travel upon. Planners and communities alike are beginning to ask not only how to make travel faster and cleaner, but how to make it more equitable, ensuring that the quiet lanes serving older villages or less affluent districts receive their share of attention. Experiments with community-funded micro-improvements, perhaps a short stretch of permeable paving paid for by local crowdfunding, echo the medieval practice of collective labor while harnessing modern tools and expectations. In this way, the long evolution feels less like a straight line of progress and more like a slow, thoughtful conversation that has been going on for centuries, each generation adding its own layer of understanding and adaptation. The ground beneath our feet still holds the memory of mud and ruts, of labor and delay, yet it also carries the promise of surfaces that work with us rather than against us. And it is precisely in this moment of careful, forward-looking refinement, as new ideas about energy, ecology, and everyday mobility begin to take shape in test beds and policy documents across the continent, that the path ahead for Europe's roads opens onto yet another stretch of quiet possibility. And it is precisely in this moment of careful, forward-looking refinement, as new ideas about energy, ecology, and everyday mobility begin to take shape in test beds and policy documents across the continent, that the path ahead for Europe's roads opens onto yet another stretch of quiet possibility. What began as the crumbling legacy of Roman engineering, slowly overtaken by mud and neglect in the centuries we call the Middle Ages, has become a vast, living network that now carries electric currents, digital signals, and the daily rhythms of millions of lives. The same ground that once turned simple journeys into exhausting ordeals, ankle-deep sludge sucking at boots, cartwheels vanishing to their axles, travelers measuring progress in sore muscles and lost daylight, now supports surfaces that generate power, heal themselves, and communicate with the vehicles rolling across them. The misery that shaped so much of medieval existence has not been erased, but it has been pushed to the edges. A fleeting inconvenience on a rural lane after an unseasonal storm, rather than the defining condition of every mile traveled. Looking back across the long arc, one sees how each era added its own layer to the story. The feudal patchwork of local obligation gave way to royal statutes and turnpike trusts, which in turn yielded to national motorways and today's smart corridors. Every improvement carried its own quiet contradictions. Better surfaces invited more traffic, which demanded still better surfaces. Speed and comfort for some often left others navigating the same old earth tracks. Yet through it all, ordinary people adapted with remarkable patience, wrapping their feet against the wet, probing ruts with long staffs, planning routes by the color of the sky and the feel of the wind. That practical wisdom, born in the high Middle Ages and refined across centuries, still lingers in the small decisions we make before setting out, even when our vehicles are guided by satellites and the road itself seems almost alive. The deeper truth revealed by this long history is not simply that roads improved, but that they have always reflected the society moving upon them. Fragmented authority left them neglected. Growing commerce coaxed modest repairs. Industrial ambition and post-war recovery reshaped them into instruments of national purpose. Today's concerns about climate and equity are nudging them toward resilience and inclusion. The ground beneath our feet has never been neutral. It has carried the weight of kings and merchants, pilgrims and peasants, armies and commuters, absorbing their ambitions and returning them, season after season, in mud or smoothness, delay or ease. What feels to us like modern convenience is, in truth, the latest chapter in an ancient conversation between human intention and the stubborn realities of soil, weather, and time. In the end, the story of Europe's roads is less about conquering distance than about learning, slowly and imperfectly, to live with it. The simple act of traveling from one village to the next or one city to another remains what it has always been. A negotiation with the landscape, now conducted with far greater knowledge and far gentler tools. We stand on the shoulders of countless generations who walked those same alignments, who filled ruts with gravel and cleared ditches by hand, who accepted discomfort as part of the natural order. Their endurance made our smoother journeys possible. And as we look forward to roads that may one day charge our vehicles while we travel, or adjust their own surfaces to meet the changing climate, we carry forward that same quiet understanding. The ground will continue to ask something of us, and we, in turn, will keep finding new ways to answer. If this long journey through the forgotten hardships and gradual triumphs of Europe's roads has offered you a peaceful place to drift and reflect, perhaps you might consider what small details surprised you most, or which era's travelers you found it hardest to imagine sharing the road with. These thoughtful conversations are what keep this channel alive. Until the next quiet descent into the past, thank you for traveling with us. Safe journeys wherever the road may lead you next.